I'm waiting on Trisha's decision about whether or not she'll allow me to go see her again. I don't know how long I can wait. She's really special to me, but life is lonely.
It's someone that I met 2 months after Rick on vacation and work trip. He's Australian.
Rick was standing there saying he still wanted Trisha, still wanted a future with Trisha, and was even willing to accept a life where Trisha was carrying another man's baby. But the hardest part of this tell-all is that Rick's words only sound emotional until the timeline starts speaking louder than he does. Because once the cast begins pulling apart what really happened after the breakup, the whole apology starts to feel less like proof of change and more like a man trying to hold on after already proving he could not wait. The question hanging over Rick and Trisha is not just whether Rick feels sorry now, because anybody can feel sorry when the room is watching, the cameras are on, and the woman they lost is sitting there with every reason not to trust them anymore. The real question is whether Rick's apology can mean anything when he could not even make it through one full day before finding comfort somewhere else. Trisha's situation is already complicated before Rick's behavior even enters the conversation. Because she is pregnant, she is preparing for motherhood, and she confirms that Rick is not the father of her baby, explaining that the father is an Australian man she met after Rick during a vacation and work trip, and even though she is no longer in a relationship with that man, he is still connected to her life because of the baby. That detail alone would have been enough to test Rick, especially because the script makes it clear that Rick has struggled with jealousy before. And if he could become uncomfortable over Trisha even mentioning an ex, then the obvious question becomes how he would handle a future where Trisha has a permanent connection to another man through her child. But the pregnancy is not even the most damaging part of the story, because while Trisha's baby creates an emotional complication, Rick's own timeline creates a trust problem that is much harder to defend. After Trisha ended things with Rick because of the situation involving messages with his ex, Rick did not sit with the loss, did not take time to reflect, and did not show the kind of patience that would make his later promises feel solid. Instead, he went out the very next night, met another woman, and became intimate with her almost immediately. That is where the whole mood shifts, because this is not about saying Rick technically cheated in that exact moment, since Trisha had broken things off, and it would be too easy to twist the situation into something the facts do not fully support, but it is about the emotional contradiction between a man saying Trisha is special, saying he wants forgiveness, saying he wants to be part of her future, and then showing through his actions that the second he was left alone, he ran towards someone else. That does not make his feelings fake automatically, but it does make them look unstable, and there is a big difference between loving someone and needing someone around so badly that any empty space feels like a crisis. Rick seems to frame his behavior around loneliness, and maybe that fear explains why he jumps from one emotional connection to another, but explaining a pattern is not the same as repairing the damage, and that is where Trisha's position becomes so important. Trisha still has feelings for Rick, and that is what makes the whole situation more painful, because she is not sitting there as someone who never cared, or someone who can easily turn cold overnight, but she also does not look as desperate for his attention as she once may have seemed, and for the first time, the power in the story begins to move away from Rick's promises and toward Trisha's decision. Rick wants access back into Trisha's life, but Trisha is the one who has to decide whether access is safe, whether his words have weight, and whether bringing him near her pregnancy and her future would bring peace or more emotional noise. And that is why the airport moment matters so much, because Rick did not only move on quickly, he later kissed Trisha and acted like there was still a chance, while the audience now knows another woman had already entered the picture, which leaves one uncomfortable question sitting right in the middle of everything. If Rick wanted Trisha to believe he had changed, why did Trisha have to learn the full truth only after the damage was already done? The airport moment is where Rick's story stops looking like a messy rebound and starts looking like something much more painful for Trisha. Because by that point, the issue was no longer only that he moved on fast, it was that he stood in front of the woman he claimed to still want, kissed her, allowed her to believe there might still be something worth saving, and still did not clearly give her the full truth about what had already happened with another woman. That is why this part of the tell-all hits differently, because Rick can argue that he and Trisha were not officially together when he went out the next night, and technically that part mattered, because Trisha had ended things after finding out he was still involved in communication with his ex, but the emotional problem is that Rick was not acting like a man who was fully moving on and closing one door before opening another one. He was acting like someone who wanted to keep Trisha emotionally close, while also giving himself permission to chase comfort somewhere else. The timeline is what makes it so hard to ignore, because Trisha breaks things off, Rick goes out the very next night, he meets another woman before he even properly settles into the night. The situation becomes physical almost immediately. And then later, he is still trying to convince Trisha that he wants another chance, which creates the question nobody in that room can really move past. Was Rick genuinely trying to rebuild what he broke with Trisha, or was he trying to keep Trisha available while he tested out another connection in the background? That question matters because viewers are going to divide on this one, and that division is exactly why the situation feels so uncomfortable. Because one side will say Rick was single, Trisha had already ended the relationship, and he had the right to do whatever he wanted after the breakup, while the other side will say that if he truly loved Trisha the way he claimed, and if he truly wanted forgiveness the way he said he did, then moving on that quickly makes every emotional speech sound weaker. And the more the cast presses him, the harder it becomes for Rick to hide behind the technical side of the breakup. Because Trisha's issue is not just that he was with someone else, her issue is that he kissed her at the airport and let her stand there with hope while he already knew there was something he had not fully told her. That is the part that makes Trisha look hurt in a deeper way. Because she was not making decisions with complete information, and when someone is asking for your heart again, the missing details matter just as much as the words they are saying out loud. Then the story gets worse, because the other woman was not simply one impulsive night that ended and disappeared, it turned into a 5-month relationship while Rick was still communicating with Trisha, and once that detail comes out, the whole situation changes shape. Now it no longer feels like one lonely night after a breakup, it begins to look like a pattern where Rick keeps more than one emotional door open, and that makes his apology feel unstable, because an apology can sound real in the moment, but if the behavior underneath it keeps chasing attention, comfort, or backup options, then the apology starts to feel more like damage control than actual change. For Trisha, that is humiliating in a quiet way. Because she still cared, she showed up, she kissed him, and she listened to him talk about wanting another chance, only to later realize that the version of the story she had at the airport was incomplete. And once the audience understands that, the next question becomes even harder for Rick, because the overnight relationship was not the only timeline problem exposed at the Tell All, and the Colombia trip brings back the same trust issue from a different angle. The Colombia trip is where Rick's story becomes harder to separate into one bad choice, because once that timeline comes up, the problem no longer looks like a single rebound after a breakup, it starts looking like the same pattern repeating with different women, different excuses, and the same result for Trisha, who keeps being asked to believe that this time Rick really understands what he has done. At first, Rick tries to make the situation sound smaller by focusing on when the trip was booked, because he booked it during the 5 days when Trisha was not speaking to him. And on the surface, that might sound like an emotional reaction during a fight, but the part that changes everything is that he did not actually take the trip while things were still completely broken between them. He went later, when he and Trisha were already talking again. That detail mattered, because there is a huge difference between making a reckless decision while feeling rejected and following through with that decision after the relationship has already started moving again. And once the cast gets Rick to admit that he was back in contact with Trisha when he still went to Colombia, the whole defense begins to weaken. Rick wants the room to see the Colombia situation as something that happened before the relationship had fully become physical, or before he and Trisha had met in person in a way that made the betrayal feel more serious, but Trisha does not let him hide behind that version of the timeline, because her point is that even after they had met, even after he knew what she felt, even after the relationship had already become emotionally real, he still kept doing things that made her question whether he could actually be loyal. And that is why this moment is so uncomfortable, because Trisha is not reacting to one isolated mistake that came out of nowhere. She is reacting to a collection of choices that all seem to point in the same direction, with Rick moving toward an ex when things get difficult, moving toward another woman after the breakup, and then still trying to keep Trisha close enough to believe there might be a future. The conversation also brings up one of the most disrespectful details in the whole segment, when Trisha says Rick had used the same intimate item with his Colombian ex and then brought it into his relationship with her, and even without making that moment crude, the meaning is obvious. Because for Trisha, it is not just awkward, it makes her feel like the boundaries between these women were never treated with the seriousness they deserve. That detail adds another layer to the disrespect, because it is not only about physical behavior or emotional betrayal, it is about Rick making choices that blur the past and present in a way that leaves Trisha feeling compared, replaced, and pulled into something she never agreed to be part of. Some viewers may still look at Rick and say he admitted he made mistakes, and maybe that admission should count for something. But others will look at the way he laughs, explains, and tries to soften every timeline, and they will wonder whether he truly understands the weight of what he put Trisha through. That is where Rick's fear of being alone becomes important, not as an excuse, but as a pattern. Because if loneliness is what keeps pushing him toward the next available connection, then Trisha is not just dealing with one betrayal, she is dealing with a man who may not know how to sit still long enough to prove he can be trusted. And for Trisha, every new detail makes her past forgiveness look more painful, because she gave Rick chances, she listened to promises, and she clearly still has feelings somewhere under all that hurt. But the more the timeline gets exposed, the harder it becomes to believe that love alone is enough to fix this. By the end of this part, Rick says he has not spoken to that ex in months and still wants a future with Trisha and her baby. But after everything that has been laid out, the real question is no longer whether Rick can say the right thing in front of everyone. It is whether Trisha's silence means she still has hope, or whether she is finally too tired to keep confusing his apologies with change. Rick may still be sitting there saying he wants another chance, saying he wants to see Trisha again, saying he wants the opportunity to ask for forgiveness face to face, but by this point the story is no longer moving Rick's excuses, because the more the tell-all exposes, the more it becomes clear that Rick is not the one holding the future anymore. Trisha is. That shift matters because for most of this relationship, Rick's actions created the damage and Trisha was left reacting to it, but now the pressure changes direction. Because Rick can talk, explain, apologize, and promise as much as he wants, yet none of those words give him automatic access back into Trisha's life. He says he is waiting for Trisha's decision, and that sentence sounds emotional on the surface, but it also shows how much control he has lost. Because the same man who kept moving between old connections, new connections, and unfinished conversations is now asking the one woman he hurt to decide whether he is even allowed close enough to prove anything. And that is where Trisha's response becomes the most important part of this whole segment, because she does not completely slam the door, but she also does not run back into the same cycle just because Rick looks emotional in front of everyone. She leaves a small opening by saying she wants to see how he acts, and that one detail is exactly where viewers will probably split, because some people will think she should have closed the door completely after everything that came out, while others will understand that feelings do not disappear just because the facts are ugly, and Trisha can still care about Rick while also knowing that caring about him is not enough reason to let him disturb her peace again. That is the human part of this story, because Trisha is not acting like someone who suddenly became cold or careless. She is acting like someone who still has feelings, but is finally learning that feelings need boundaries, especially now that her life is not only about romantic disappointment anymore. She is pregnant, she is preparing to become a mother, and when she says she is excited and happy about that and does not want anyone to change the way she feels, that becomes the strongest moment in the entire conversation. Because for once the focus is not Rick's loneliness, Rick's guilt, Rick's apology, or Rick's need for another chance. The focus becomes Trisha's future. And that is exactly why Rick's apology still feels difficult to trust. Because if he truly wanted to prove change, patience would be part of the proof, not just another obstacle he complains about while waiting to see whether Trisha lets him back in. When Rick is asked if there is anyone else in his life, he says no, And maybe on paper that should sound reassuring, but after everything the timeline has already revealed, it does not land as cleanly as he probably wants it to. Because this is the same man who moved on the next night, continued another relationship for months, and still kept emotional ties around Trisha. Then comes the line that quietly undercuts his entire plea. Because Rick admits Trisha has encouraged him to move on, and he is starting to consider it. That is a small sentence, but it carries a lot of weight. Because suddenly the man who says he wants Trisha and her baby in his future is also saying he may not be able to wait. And once he says that life is lonely, the whole room is left with the clearest version of the problem. Rick may want forgiveness, but he also seems to want comfort immediately. And for Trisha, that may be the biggest warning sign of all. Because a man who truly wants to prove he has changed would understand that waiting is not punishment, waiting is evident. And if Rick cannot handle being alone long enough to respect her decision, then the question is no longer whether Trisha still has feelings for him, it is whether those feelings are worth risking the peace she is finally trying to protect. So after everything Rick said, after every apology, every promise, every emotional answer, the real question comes back to the same uncomfortable place where this whole story started. Because if Rick cannot wait, if Rick cannot sit with consequence, if Rick cannot stay steady long enough for Trisha to decide whether he belongs in her life, then what does his apology actually prove? By this point, the audience has seen enough of the pattern to understand why Trisha cannot simply accept the words and ignore the timeline. Because Rick says he wants a future with Trisha, and even says he is willing to be part of a life that includes her baby, but this is also the same man who moved on the next night after the breakup, the same man whose quick rebound turned into a 5-month relationship, and the same man whose Colombia trip brought his ex back into a story where Trisha was already struggling to believe him. That is why Rick's final admission matters so much, because when he says life is lonely and he does not know how long he can wait, it sounds honest in a way that almost everything else struggled to sound honest, not because it makes him look better, but because it reveals the engine behind the whole cycle. Rick may miss Trisha, he may regret losing her, and he may even believe in that moment that he wants to fix what he broke, but regret is not the same thing as readiness. And wanting someone back is not the same thing as being emotionally stable enough to protect them from the same pain again. The problem with Rick is not that he has no emotion, because clearly there is emotion there, but emotion without consistency becomes pressure. And pressure is exactly what Trisha does not need while she is pregnant, preparing for motherhood, and trying to protect a happiness that finally seems to belong to her, instead of being controlled by Rick's next explanation. A changed person does not only sound sorry when the room is watching, and a changed person does not make forgiveness feel like a countdown before they run toward the next available comfort. Because real change would mean accepting that Trisha has every right to take her time, every right to keep distance, and every right to decide that love is not enough if peace keeps getting destroyed. And that is where Trisha's ending feels stronger than Rick's apology, because she does not have to become cold to become clear. And she does not have to stop caring about Rick to understand that caring about him does not mean giving him access to her life, her pregnancy, or her future. She still has feelings, and that makes the situation harder, but she also says she is excited to become a mother and does not want anyone changing that feeling, which tells us that Trisha is finally starting to place her peace above the hope that Rick might become the man he keeps describing. So maybe the most painful truth is that Rick's biggest test was never whether he could apologize in front of everyone, it was whether he could stay steady after being told no. And right now, his own words make that answer feel uncertain. Rick may want Trisha, but if loneliness is strong enough to pull him somewhere else the moment waiting becomes uncomfortable, then Trisha has to ask herself whether letting him back in would be love, or just another way of letting the same pattern start again. So the real debate is not only whether Rick moved on too quickly, it is whether he kept asking Trisha to believe in a future while acting like he could not survive the waiting it would take to earn one.